hall, the only other one in the room. Cadswain did not control the questioning herself. Not yet. Letting another lead the interrogation worked to her advantage. It let her think and plan. Outside the room, Ariane, Serene, and Nasuna held the prisoner's shield, two more than were normally considered necessary. One did not take chances with the Forsaken. Their prisoner was Semirag, a monster who many thought was simply a legend. Cadswain did not know how many of the stories about the woman were true. She did know that Semirag was not easily intimidated, unsettled, or manipulated, and that was a problem. "Well," Maurice demanded, "my question. You have an answer?" Semirag regarded Maurice, icy contempt in her voice as she spoke. "Do you know what happens to a man when his blood is replaced with something else?" "I did not. He dies, of course," Semirag said, cutting Maurice off with words like knives. "The death often happens instantly, and quick deaths are of little interest. With experiment, I discovered that some solutions can replace blood more effectively, allowing the subject to live for a short time after the transfusion." She fell silent. "Answer the question," Maurice said, "or out the window you will hang again, and the transfusion itself requires use of the power, of course," Semirag interrupted again. "Other methods are not quick enough. I invented the weave myself. It can suddenly and instantly pull the blood from a body and deposit it in a bin, while at the same time taking a solution and pressing it into the veins." Maurice gritted her teeth, glancing at Narishma. The Ashaman wore a coat and trousers of black as usual, his long dark hair in braids woven with bells on the ends. He lounged against the log wall. He had a boyish face, but displayed a growing edge of danger. Perhaps that came from training with Maurice's other warders. Perhaps it came from associating with people who would put one of the Forsaken to the question. "My warning," Maurice began again. "I had one subject survive an entire hour after the transfusion," Semirag said in a calm, conversational tone. "I count it as one of my greatest victories. He was in pain the entire time, of course. True pain. Agony that he could feel in every vein of his body, right down to the near invisible ones in his fingers. I know of no other way to bring such suffering to every part of the body at once." She met Maurice's eyes. "I will show you the weave someday." Maurice paled just slightly. With a whip of her hand, Cadswain wove a shield of air around Semirag's head to block her from hearing, then wove fire and air into two small balls of light, which she placed directly in front of the Forsaken's eyes. The lights weren't bright enough to blind or damage her eyes, but they would keep her from seeing. That was a particular trick of Cadswain's. Too many sisters would think to deafen a captive, yet leave them capable of watching. One never knew who had learned to read lips, and Cadswain had little inclination to underestimate her current captive. Maurice glanced at Cadswain, a flash of annoyance in her eyes. "You were losing control of her," Cadswain said firmly, setting her tea on the floor beside her chair. Maurice hesitated, then nodded, looking truly angry, likely at herself. "This woman, nothing works on her," she said. "She never changes the tone of her voice no matter what we do to her. Every punishment I can think of only creates more threats, each one more gruesome than the last. What?" She gritted her teeth again, refolding her arms and breathing deeply through her nose. Narishma straightened as if to walk over to her, but she waved him back. Maurice was appropriately firm with her warders, though she did snap at anyone else who tried to keep them in their places. "We can break her," Cadswain said. "Can we, Cadswain?" "Faugh! Of course we can. She is human just like anyone else." "True," Maurice said, "though she's lived for 3,000 years. 3,000, Cadswain." "She spent the bulk of that time imprisoned," Cadswain said with a dismissive sniff. "Centuries locked up in the Dark One's prison, likely in a trance or hibernation. Subtract those years, and she'd be no older than any of us. A fair sight younger than some, I would imagine. It was a subtle reminder of her own age, something rarely discussed among Aes Sedai. The entire conversation about age was, in fact, a sign of how uncomfortable the Forsaken made Maurice. Aes Sedai were practiced at appearing calm, but there was a reason that Cadsuane had kept those holding the shield outside the room. They gave away too much.
Hey,
Even the
Fire, how you
normally
doing, bro?
unflappable Maurice lost control far too often during these interrogations. Of course, Maurice and the others, like all the women in the tower these days, still fell short of what an Aes Sedai should be. These
I'm
younger
gonna roll
Aes
a
Sedai had
couple
been
up.
allowed to grow soft and weak, prone to bickering. Some had allowed themselves to be bullied into swearing fealty to
Glad you
Randall
made
Thor.
it.
Sometimes Cadsuane wished she could simply send them all to penance for a few decades. Or maybe that was just Cadsuane's age speaking. She was old, and that was making her increasingly intolerant of foolishness. Over 2 centuries ago, she'd sworn to herself that she'd live to attend the last battle, no matter how long that took. Using the one power lengthened one's years, and she'd found that determination and grit could stretch those years even further. She was one of the oldest people alive. Unfortunately, her years had taught her that no measure of planning or determination could make life turn out as you wanted. That didn't stop her from being annoyed when it
But it's
didn't.
gonna be some roach weed.
One might have thought that the years would also have taught her patience, but it had done the opposite. The older she grew, the less inclined she was to wait, for she knew she didn't have many years left. Anyone who claimed that old age had brought them patience was either lying or senile. She can and will be broken, Cadsuane repeated. I am not going to allow a person who knows weaves from the age of legends to simply dance herself to execution. We are going to pull every scrap of knowledge from that woman's brain if we have to turn a few of her own creative weaves on her. The Adam, if only the Lord Dragon would let us use it on her, Maurice said, glancing at Semirag. If ever Cadsuane had been tempted to break her word, it was regarding that. Slip an Adam on the woman, but no. In order to force someone to talk with an Adam, you had to give them pain. It was the same as torture, and Althor had forbidden it. Semirag had closed her eyes against Cadsuane's lights, but she was still composed, controlled. What was going on in that woman's mind? Did she wait for rescue? Did she think to force them to execute her so that she could avoid true torture? Did she really assume that she'd be able to escape, then wreak vengeance on the Aes Sedai who had questioned her? Likely the last, and it was hard not to feel at least a hint of apprehension. The woman knew things about the One Power that hadn't survived even in legends. 3,000 years was a long, long time. Could Semirag break through a shield in a way that was unknown? If she could, why hadn't she already? Cadsuane wouldn't be entirely comfortable until she was able to get her hands on some of that forkroot tea. Your weaves. You can release them, Cadsuane, Maurice said, standing. I have composed myself. I fear we will have to hang her out the window for a time, as I said. Perhaps we can threaten her with pain. She can't know of Althor's foolish requirements. Cadsuane leaned forward, releasing the weaves that hung the lights before the Forsaken's eyes, but not removing the shield of air that kept her from hearing. Semirag's eyes snapped open, then quickly
Some
found Cadsuane.
roaches.
Yes, she knew who was in charge. The two locked eyes. Maurice continued to question, asking about Grandal. Althor thought the other Forsaken might be somewhere in Arad Doman. Cadsuane was far more interested in other questions, but Grandal made an acceptable starting point. Semirag responded to Maurice's questions with silence this time, and Cadsuane found herself thinking about Althor. The boy had resisted her teaching as stubbornly as Semirag resisted questioning. Oh, true, he had learned some minor things. How to treat her with a measure of respect, how to at least feign civility, but nothing more. Cadsuane hated admitting failure, and this was not a failure, not yet, but she was close. That boy was destined to destroy the world, and maybe save it, too. The first was inevitable, the second conditional. She could wish the two were reversed, but wishes were about as useful as coins carved from wood. You could paint them however you wanted, but they remained wood. She gritted her teeth, putting the boy out of her mind. She needed to watch Semirag. Each time the woman spoke, it could be a clue. Semirag returned her stare, ignoring Maurice. How did you break one of the most powerful women who had ever lived? A woman who had perpetrated countless atrocities during the days of wonder, before even the Dark One's release. Meeting those black onyx eyes, Cadswain realized something. Althor's prohibition on hurting Semirag was meaningless. They could not break this woman with pain. Semirag was the great torturer of the Forsaken, a woman intrigued by death and agony. No, she would not break that way, even if the means had been allowed them. With a chill looking into those eyes, Cadswain thought she saw something of herself in the creature. Age, craftiness, and unwillingness to budge. That then left a question for her. If given the task, how would Cadswain go about breaking herself? The concept was so disturbing that she was relieved when Coril interrupted the interrogation a few moments later. The slender, cheerful Mirandian was loyal to Cadswain and had been on duty watching over Althor this afternoon. Coril's word that Althor would be meeting soon with his Aiel chiefs brought an end to the interrogation, and the three sisters maintaining the shield entered and towed Semirag off to the room where they would set her bound and gagged with flows of air. Cadswain watched the Forsaken go, carried on weaves of air, then shook her head. Semirag had been only the day's opening scene. It was time to deal with the boy.
Chapter 6. When Iron Melts. Rodo Ituralda had seen a lot of battlefields. Some things were always the same. Dead men like piles of rags lying in heaps. Ravens eager to dine. Groans, cries, whimpers, and mumbles from those unlucky enough to need a long time to die. Each battlefield also had its own individual print. You could read a battle like the trail of passing game. Corpses lying in rows that were disturbingly straight indicated a charge of footmen who had been pressed against volleys of arrows. Scattered and trampled bodies were the result of infantry breaking before heavy cavalry. This battle had seen large numbers of Shonchan crushed up against the walls of Darluna, where they had fought with desperation, hammered against the stone. One section of wall was completely torn away where some Damani had tried to escape into the city. Fighting in streets and among homes would have favored the Shonchan. They hadn't made it in time. Ituralda rode his roan gelding through the mess. Battle was always a mess. The only neat battles were the ones in stories or history books. Those had been cleansed and scoured by the abrasive hands of scholars looking for conciseness. Aggressor won, 53,000 killed, or defender stood, 20,000 fallen. What would be written of this battle? It would depend on who was riding. They would neglect to include the blood, pounded into the earth to make mud, the bodies broken, pierced, and mangled, the ground torn in swaths by enraged Damani. Perhaps they would remember the numbers. Those often seemed important to scribes. Half of Ituralda's 100,000 dead. On any other battlefield, 50,000 casualties would have shamed and angered him. But he'd faced down a force 3 times his size, and one with Damani at that. He followed the young messenger who had fetched him, a boy of perhaps 12, wearing a Shonchan uniform of red and green. They passed a fallen standard, hanging from a broken pole with the tip driven into mud. It bore the sign of a sun being crossed by 6 gulls. Ituralda hated not knowing the houses and names of the men he was fighting, but there was no way to tell with the foreign Shonchan. The shadows cast by a dying evening sun striped the field. Soon a blanket of darkness would cradle the bodies, and the survivors could pretend for a time that the grassland was a grave for their friends, and for the people their friends had killed. He rounded a small hillock, coming to a scattered pattern of fallen Shonchan elite. Most of these dead wore those insect-like helms, bent, cracked, or dented. Dead eyes stared blankly from openings behind twisted mandibles. The Shonchan general was alive, if just barely. His helmet was off, and there was blood on his lips. He leaned against a large, moss-covered boulder, back supported by a bundled cloak, as if he were waiting for a meal to be delivered. Of course, that image was marred by his twisted leg, and the broken haft of a spear punching through the front of his stomach. Ituralda dismounted. Like most of his men, Ituralda wore workers' clothing, simple brown trousers and coat, borrowed off of the man who had taken Ituralda's uniform as part of the trap. It felt odd to be out of uniform. A man like this General Turin did not deserve a soldier in drab. Ituralda waved the messenger boy to stand back, out of earshot, then approached the Shonchan alone. "You're him, then," Turin said, looking up at Ituralda, speaking with that slow Shonchan drawl. He was a stout man, far from tall, with a peaked nose. His close-cropped black hair was shaved 2 finger widths up each side of his head, and his helm lay beside him on the ground, bearing 3 white plumes. He reached up with an unsteady, black-gloved hand and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. "I am," Ituralda said. "They call you a great captain in Taraban." "They do." "It's deserved," Turin said, coughing. "How did you do it? Our scouts..." His cough consumed him. "Rakan," Ituralda said once the cough subsided. He squatted down beside his foe. The sun was still a sliver in the west, lighting the battlefield with a glimmer of golden red light. "Your scouts see from the air, and truth is easy to hide from a distance." "The army behind us?" "Women and youths, mostly," Ituralda said. "A fair number of farmers as well, wearing uniforms taken from my troops here." "And if we'd turned and attacked?" "You wouldn't have. Your Rakan told you that you were outnumbered. Better to chase after the smaller force ahead of you. Better than that, to head for the city your scouts say is barely defended, even if it means marching your men near to exhaustion." Turin coughed again, nodding. Yes. But the city was empty.
Understood that.
How did you get troops into it?" "Scouts in the air," Ituralda said. "Can't see inside buildings."
But it's just reclaim.
"You ordered your troops to hide inside for that long?" "Yes," Ituralda said, "with a rotation allowing a small number out each day to work the fields." Turin shook his head in disbelief. "You realize what you have done," he said. There was no threat in his voice.
It's not the greatest,
In
but
fact,
it's
there was a fair
reclaim.
amount of admiration.
It still works.
Lady Siroth will never accept this failure. She will have to break you now, if only to save face." "I know," Ituralda said, standing. "But I can't drive you back by attacking you in fortresses. I need you to come to me." "You don't understand the numbers we have," Turin said. "What you've destroyed today is but a breeze compared to the storm you've raised. Enough of my people escaped today to tell of your tricks. They will not work again." He was right. The Shonchan learned quickly.
Nice little
Ituralda had
gooey
been forced to
strand.
cut short his raids in Taraban because of the swift Shonchan reaction. You know you can't beat us, Torin said softly. I see it in your eyes, great captain. Ituralda nodded. Why then? Torin asked. Why does a crow fly? Ituralda asked. Torin coughed weakly. Ituralda did know that he could not win his war against the Shan-Chan. Oddly, each of his victories made him more certain of his eventual failure. The Shan-Chan were smart, well-equipped, and well-disciplined. More than that, they were persistent. Turin himself must have known from the moment those gates opened that he was doomed. But he had not surrendered. He had fought until his army broke, scattering in too many directions for Ituralda's exhausted troops to catch.
These definitely make my
Turin
ears a little
understood.
sore with these hoops.
Sometimes surrender wasn't
But
worth
they
the
got a
cost.
good little weight to them.
No man welcomed death, but there were far worse ends for a soldier. Abandoning one's homeland to invaders. Well, Ituralda couldn't do that. Not even if the fight was impossible to win. He did what needed to be done, when it needed to be done. And right now, Aradaman needed to fight. They would lose, but their children would always know that their fathers had resisted. That resistance would be important in 100 years, when a rebellion came. If one came. Ituralda stood up, intending to return to his waiting soldiers. Turin struggled, reaching for his sword. Ituralda hesitated, turning back. Will you do it? Turin asked. Ituralda nodded, unsheathing his own sword. It has been an honor, Turin said, then closed his eyes. Ituralda's sword, heron-marked, took the man's head a moment later. Turin's own blade bore a heron, barely visible on the gleaming length of blade the Shan-Chan had managed to pull. It was a pity that the two of them hadn't been able to cross swords, though in a way these past few weeks had been just that on a different scale. Ituralda cleaned his sword, then slid it back into its sheath. In a final gesture, he slid Turin's sword out and rammed it into the ground beside the fallen general. Ituralda then remounted and, nodding farewell to the messenger, made his way back across the shadowed field of corpses. The ravens had begun.
Outside, encouraging several of the serving men and palace guards, Liana said softly, sitting beside the bars of her cell. But it's hard. She smiled, glancing at Egwene, who sat on a stool outside the cell. I don't exactly feel
That one wasn't too
alluring
bad.
these days. Egwene's responding smile was rare, and she seemed to understand. Liana wore the same dress that she'd been captured in, and it had not yet been laundered. Every third morning she removed it and used the morning's bucket of water, after washing herself clean with a damp rag, to clean the dress in her basin. But there was only so much one could do without soap. She braided her hair to give it a semblance of neatness, but could do nothing about her ragged nails. Liana sighed, thinking of those mornings spent standing in the corner of her cell, hidden from sight, wearing nothing while she waited for the dress and shift to dry. Just because she was Domani didn't mean she liked parading about without a scrap on. Proper seduction required skill and subtlety. Nudity used neither. Her cell wasn't bad, as cells went. She had a small bed, meals, plenty of water, a chamber pot that was changed daily. But she was never allowed out, and was always guarded by two sisters who kept her shielded. The only one who visited her, save for those trying to pry information from her regarding traveling, was Egwene. The Amerlin sat on her stool, expression thoughtful. And she was Amerlin. It was impossible to think of her any other way. How could a child so young have learned so quickly? That straight back, that poised expression. Being in control wasn't so much about the power you had, but the power you implied that you had. It was much like dealing with men, actually. Have you heard anything? Liana asked. About what they plan to do with me? Egwene shook her head. Two yellow sisters sat chatting nearby on the bench, lit by a lamp on the table beside them. Lyanna hadn't answered any of the questions her captors put to her, and Tower law was very strict about the questioning of fellow sisters. They couldn't harm her, particularly not with the power, but they could just leave her alone to rot. "Thank you for coming to see me these evenings," Lyanna said, reaching through the lattice of bars to take Egwene's hand. "I believe I owe my sanity to you." "It is my pleasure," Egwene said, though her eyes showed a hint of the exhaustion she undoubtedly felt. Some of the sisters who visited Lyanna mentioned the beatings Egwene was suffering as penances for her insubordination. Odd how a novice to be instructed could be beaten, but a prisoner to be interrogated could not. And despite the pain, Egwene came to visit Lyanna in the cell virtually every night. "I will see you free, Lyanna," Egwene promised, still holding her hand. "Elida's tyranny cannot last. I'm confident it won't be long now." Lyanna nodded, letting go and standing up. Egwene took hold of the bars and pulled herself to her feet, cringing ever so slightly at the motion. She nodded farewell to
Cheers.
Lyanna, then hesitated, frowning. "What is it?" Lyanna asked. Egwene took her hands off of the bars and looked at her palms. They seemed to be coated with a reflective, waxy substance. Frowning, Lyanna looked at the bars and was shocked to see Egwene's handprints on the iron. "What in the light?" Lyanna said, poking at one of the bars. It bent beneath her finger like warm wax on the lip of a candle's bowl. Suddenly the stones beneath Lyanna's feet shifted, and she felt herself sinking. She cried out. Globs of melted wax started to rain down from the ceiling, splattering across her face. They weren't warm, but they were somehow liquid. They had the color of stone. She gasped, panicked, stumbling and sliding as her feet sank deeper in the too-slick floor. A hand caught hers. She looked up to where Egwene had grabbed her. The bars melted out of the way as Lyanna watched, the iron drooping to the sides, then liquefying. "Help!" Egwene screamed at the yellows outside. "Burn you! Stop staring!" Lyanna scrambled for purchase, terrified, trying to pull herself along the bars toward Egwene. She grasped only wax. A lump of bar came loose in her hand, squishing between her fingers, and the floor warped around her, sucking her down. And then threads of air seized her, yanking her free. The room lurched as she was tossed forward into Egwene, knocking the younger woman backward. The two yellows, white-haired Musarin and short Galarna, had jumped to their feet, and the glow of Sidar surrounded them. Musarin called for help, watching the melting cell with wide eyes. Lyanna righted herself, scrambling off of Egwene, her dress and legs coated with the strange wax, and stumbled back away from the cell. The floor here in the hallway felt stable. Light. How she wished she could embrace the source herself, but she was too full of fork root, not to mention the shield. Egwene climbed to her feet with a hand from Lyanna. The room fell still, lamp flickering, all of them staring at the cell. The melting had stopped. The bars split, the top halves frozen with drips of steel on their tips, the lower halves bent inward. Many had been flattened to the stones by Lyanna's escape. The floor inside the room had bowed inward, like a funnel, the rocks stretching. Those stones bore gashes where Lyanna's scrambling had scored them. Lyanna stood, her heart beating, realizing that only seconds had passed. What should they do? Scuttle away in fear? Was the rest of the hallway going to melt, too? Egwene stepped forward, tapping her toe against one of the bars. It resisted. Lyanna took a step forward, and her dress crunched, bits of stone like mortar falling free. She reached down and brushed at her skirt, and felt rough rock coating it instead of wax. "These sorts of events are more frequent," Egwene said calmly, glancing at the two yellows. "The Dark One is getting stronger. The last battle approaches. What is your Amerlin doing about it?" Musarin glanced at her. The tall, aging Aes Sedai looked deeply disturbed. Lyanna took Egwene's lead. forcing herself to be calm as she stepped up beside the Amerlin, chips of stone falling from her dress. Yes, well, Musarin said, you shall return to your rooms, novice. And you, she glanced at Liana, then at the remains of the cell. We will have to relocate you. And get me a new dress as well, I assume, Liana said, folding her arms. Musarin's eyes flickered at Egwene. Go. This is no longer your business, child. We will care for the prisoner. Egwene gritted her teeth, but then she turned to Liana. Stay strong, she said, and hurried away, heading down the hallway. Exhausted, disturbed by the stone-warping bubble of evil, Egwene walked with swishing skirts toward the tower wing that contained the novices' quarters. What would it take to convince the foolish women that there wasn't time to spare for squabbling? The hour was late, and few women walked the corridors, none of them novices. Egwene passed several servants bustling at late-night duties, their slippered feet falling softly on the floor tiles. These sectors of the tower were populated enough that lamps burned on the walls, trimmed low, giving an orange light. 100 different polished tiles reflected the flickering flames, looking like eyes that watched Egwene as she walked. It was hard to comprehend that this quiet evening had turned into a trap that nearly killed Liana. If even the ground itself could not be trusted, then what could? Egwene shook her head, too tired, too sore to think of solutions at the moment. She barely noticed when the floor tiles turned from gray to a deep brown. She just continued on into the tower wings, counting the doors she passed. Hers was the 7th. She froze, frowning at a pair of brown sisters, Maynadrin, a Saldean, and Nagain. The two had been speaking in hushed whispers, and they frowned at Egwene as she passed them. Why would they be in the novices' quarters? But wait, the novices' quarters didn't have brown floor tiles. This section should have had nondescript gray tiles, and the doors in the hallway were spaced far too widely. This didn't look at all like the novices' quarters. Had she been so tired that she'd walked in completely the wrong direction?
Fire, I don't have my TV no more.
She retraced her steps, passing the two brown sisters again. She found a window and looked out. The rectangular white expanse of the tower wing extended around her, just as it should. She wasn't lost. Perplexed, she looked back down the hallway. Maynadrin had folded her arms, regarding Egwene with a set of dark eyes.
Because how it was broken, it got worse.
Up to Egwene. What business have you here this time of night, child? She demanded. Did a sister send for you? You should be back in your room for sleep. Wordlessly, Egwene pointed out the window.
That kind of sucks.
Nagain glanced out, frowning. She froze, gasping softly. She looked back in at the hallway, then back out, as if unable to believe where she was.
So far,
in minutes, the entire tower was in a frenzy. Egwene, forgotten, stood at the side of a hallway with a cluster of bleary-eyed novices.
Somewhat
as sisters
luck.
argued with one another in tense voices, trying to determine what to do.
Facebook
it appeared that two sections of the tower had been swapped, and the slumbering brown sisters had been moved from their sections on the upper levels down into the wing. The novices' rooms, intact, had been placed where the section of brown sisters had been. Nobody remembered any motion or vibration when the swap happened, and the transfer appeared seamless. A line of floor tiles had been split right down the middle, then melded with tiles from the section that had shifted.
I think they have like little
small. It's getting worse and worse.
32-inch TVs
as the brown
at
sisters
Walmart
decided, for now,
for about
that they would have to accept the switch. They couldn't very well move sisters into rooms the size that novices used. That would leave the Browns divided, half in the wing, half in their old location, with a clump of novices in the middle of them. A division aptly representative of the less visible divisions the Ajas were suffering. Eventually, exhausted, Egwene and the others were sent off to sleep, though now she had to trudge up many flights of stairs before reaching her bed. Chapter 7. The Plan for Arag Doman. A storm is coming, Nynaeve said, looking out the window of the manor. Yes, replied Daigyan from her chair by the hearth without bothering to glance at the window. I think you might be right, dear. I swear it seems as if it has been overcast for weeks.
I found some on
It has
Facebook
been a single
Marketplace
week,
that are
Nynaeve said,
about
holding her
40 or
long dark
50, but
braid in one hand. She glanced at the other woman.
they're all, well, I don't
I
have a
haven't seen a
problem with them
patch
being
of clear
smart
sky in over
TVs,
10 days.
but these ones,
Daigyan frowned.
none of them have
Of the white
remotes,
Aja, she was plump and
and
curvaceous.
none of them have
She wore a
stands.
small stone on her forehead, as Moiraine had so long ago.
So I think
Though
they even had them.
Daigyan's was an
I
appropriately
think they had
white
them wall
moonstone.
mounted, and they didn't
The
keep the
tradition
stands. So
apparently had something to
I
do
don't
with
have no
being
way to
attiring
wall
a
mount it in my
noblewoman,
room.
as did the 4 colored slashes
And
the
then
woman
to
wore
get
on her dress.
another remote, it's going to cost me about
10
20
days, you
bucks
say?
on top of it.
Daigyan said. Are you certain? Nynaeve was. She paid attention to the weather. That was one of the duties of a village wisdom. She was Aes Sedai now, but that didn't mean she stopped being who she was. The weather was always there, in the back of her mind. She could sense the rain, sun, or snow in the wind's whispers. Lately, however, the sensations hadn't been like whispers at all, or like distant shouts growing louder, or like waves crashing against one another, still far to the north, yet harder and harder to ignore.
Hopefully something happens.
Well,
something comes around.
Daigyan said, I'm certain this isn't the only time in history that it has been cloudy for 10 days. Nynaeve shook her head, tugging on her braid. It's not normal, she said. And those overcast skies aren't the storm I'm talking about. It's still distant, but it's coming. And it is going to be terrible. Worse than any I've ever seen. Far worse. Well then, Daigyan said, sounding slightly uncomfortable. We will deal with it when it arrives. Are you going to sit down so that we can continue? Nynaeve glanced at the plump Aes Sedai. Daigyan was extremely weak in the power. The white might just be the weakest Aes Sedai that Nynaeve had ever met. By traditional, yet unspoken rules, that meant that Nynaeve should be allowed to take the lead. Unfortunately, Nynaeve's position was still questionable. Egwene had raised her to the shawl by decree, just as she raised Elaine. There had been no testing, nor had Nynaeve sworn on the oath rod. To most, even those who accepted Egwene's place as the true Amerlin, those omissions made Nynaeve something less than an Aes Sedai. Not an accepted, but hardly equal to a sister. The sisters with Cadsuane were particularly bad, as they hadn't declared for either the White Tower or the rebels. And the sisters sworn to Rand were worse. Most were still loyal to the White Tower, not seeing a problem with supporting both Elida and Rand. Nynaeve still wondered what Rand had been thinking, allowing sisters to swear fealty to him. She'd explained his mistake to him on several occasions, quite rationally, but talking to Rand these days was like talking to a stone, only less effective and infinitely more infuriating. Daigyan was still waiting for her to sit.
Give me
Rather than provoke a contest of wills,
go and
Nynaeve
get my pillows for this
Daigyan
chair.
was still suffering from having lost her warder, Eben, and Ashaman, during the fight with the
just this
Forsaken.
chair by itself is,
Nynaeve had spent that
after a
fight
while, it'll start
completely
hurting.
absorbed by providing Rand with immense amounts of Sidar to weave. Nynaeve could still remember the sheer joy, the awesome euphoria, strength, and sheer feel of life that had come from drawing that much power. It frightened her. She was glad the ter'angreal she'd used to touch that power had been destroyed. But the male ter'angreal was still intact, an access key to a powerful sa'angreal. As far as Nynaeve knew, Rand had not been able to persuade Cadsuane to return it to him. As well she shouldn't. No human being, not even the Dragon Reborn, should channel that much of the one power. The things one could be tempted to do. She'd told Rand that he needed to forget about the access key, like talking to a stone. A big red-haired, iron-faced idiot of a stone. Nynaeve harumphed to herself. That caused Daigyan to raise an eyebrow. The woman was quite good at controlling her grief, though Nynaeve, whose room in the Damani mansion was beside Daigyan's, heard the woman crying to herself at night. It was not easy to lose one's warder. Lan. No, best not to think of him at the moment. Lan would be fine. Only at the end of his journey of thousands of miles would he be in danger. It was there he intended to throw himself at the shadow like a lone arrow loosed at a brick wall. No, she thought to herself, he will not be alone. I saw to that. Very well, Nynaeve said, forcing herself to focus. Let us continue. She showed no deference to Daigyan. She was doing this woman a favor, distracting her from her grief. That was how Coriel had explained it anyway. It wasn't certainly for Nynaeve's benefit that they met. She had nothing to prove. She was Aes Sedai, no matter what the others thought or implied. This was all just a ruse to help Daigyan. That was it. Nothing else. Here is the 81st weave, the White said. The glow of Sidar sprang up around her, and she channeled, crafting a very complex weave of fire, air, and spirit. Complex, but useless. The weave created 3 burning rings of fire in the air, which glowed with unusual light. But what was the point of that? Nynaeve already knew how to make fireballs and balls of light. Why waste time learning weaves that repeated what she already knew, only in a far more complicated way? And why did each ring have to be a slightly different color? Nynaeve waved an indifferent hand, repeating the weave exactly. Honestly, she said, that one seems the most useless of the bunch. What is the point of all these? Daigyan pursed her lips. She said nothing, but Nynaeve knew that Daigyan thought that this all should be far more difficult for Nynaeve than it was. Eventually the woman spoke. You cannot be told much about the testing. The only thing I can say is that you will need to repeat these weaves exactly and do so while undergoing extreme distraction. When the time comes, you will understand. I doubt it, Nynaeve said flatly, copying the weave 3 times over while she spoke. Because, as I believe I've told you a dozen times already, I'm not going to be taking the test. I'm already Aes Sedai. Of course you are, dear. Nynaeve ground her teeth. This had been a bad idea. When she'd approached Coriel, supposedly a member of Nynaeve's own Aja, the woman had refused to acknowledge her as an equal. She'd been pleasant about it, as Coriel often was, but the implication had been clear. She'd even seemed sympathetic. Sympathetic! As if Nynaeve needed her pity. She had suggested that if Nynaeve knew the 100 weaves each accepted learned for the test to become Aes Sedai, it might help with her credibility. The problem was, this placed Nynaeve in a situation where she was all but treated as a student again. She did see the use in knowing the 100 weaves. She'd spent far too short a time studying them, and virtually every sister knew it. However, by accepting the lessons, she hadn't meant to imply that she saw herself as a student. She reached for her braid, but stopped herself. Her visible expressions of emotion were another factor in how she was treated by the other Aes Sedai. If only she had that ageless face. Bah! Daigyan's next weave made a popping sound in the air, and once again the weave itself was needlessly complex. Nynaeve copied it with barely a thought, committing it to memory at the same time. Daigyan stared at the weave for a moment, a distant look on her face. What? Nynaeve asked testily. Oh, nothing.
Hell yeah, fire. I'll still be here.
The last time I made that weave, I used it to startle.
You gotta make my chair a little bit more comfortable.
Ebony, her warder
right
had been
now
young,
it's just
maybe 15 or 16, and she'd been very fond of him. Eben and Daigyan had played games together like a boy and an elder sister, rather than Aes Sedai and warder. A youth of only 16, Nynaeve thought. Dead. Did Rand have to recruit them so young? Daigyan's face grew stiff, controlling her emotions far better than Nynaeve would have been able to. Light send that I'm never in the same situation, she thought, at least not for many, many years. Lan wasn't her warder yet, but she meant to have him as soon as possible. He was already her husband, after all. It still angered her that Mirel had the bond. I might be able to help, Daigyan, Nynaeve said, leaning forward, laying her hand on the other woman's knee. If I were to attempt a healing, perhaps. No, the woman said curtly. But I doubt you could help. Anything can be healed, Nynaeve said stubbornly. Even if we don't know how yet. Anything save death. And what would you do, dear? Daigyan asked. Nynaeve wondered if she refused to call her by name on purpose, or if it was an unconscious effect of their relationship. She couldn't use child as she would with an actual accepted, but to call her Nynaeve might imply equality. I could do something, Nynaeve said. This pain you feel, it has to be an effect of the bond, and therefore something to do with the one power. If the power causes your pain, then the power can take that pain away.
Okay.
And why would I want that? Daigyan asked, in control once again.
A little bit more comfortable now.
Well, because it's pain. It hurts. It should, Daigyan said.
Again.
Eben is dead. Would you want to forget your pain if you lost that hulking giant of yours? Have your feelings for him cut away like some spoiled chunk of flesh in an otherwise good roast? Nynaeve opened her mouth, but stopped. Would she? It wasn't that simple. Her feelings for Lan were genuine and not due to a bond. He was her husband, and she loved him. Daigyan had been possessive of her warder, but it had been the affection of an aunt for her favored nephew. It wasn't the same. But would Nynaeve want that pain taken away?
It leaks out
She closed her mouth, suddenly realizing the honor in Daigyan's words. I see. I'm sorry. It is nothing, dear, Daigyan continued. The logic of it seems simple to me at times, but I fear that others do not accept it. Indeed, some might argue that the logic of the issue depends on the moment and the individual. Shall I show you the next weave? Yes, please, Nynaeve said, frowning. She herself was so strong in the power, one of the strongest alive, that she often took little thought for her ability. It was much as a very tall man rarely paid attention to other people's heights. Everyone else was shorter than he, and so their different heights didn't matter much. What was it like to be this woman who had spent longer as an accepted than anyone else in memory?
On the bottom
a woman who had barely attained the shawl, doing so, many said, by an eyelash and a whisper. Daigyan had to show deference to all other Aes Sedai. If two sisters met, Daigyan was always the lesser. If more than two sisters met, Daigyan served them tea. Before the more powerful sisters, she was expected to scrape and grovel. Well, not that she was Aes Sedai, but still. There is something wrong with this system, Daigyan, Nynaeve said absently. With the testing? It seems appropriate that there should be some kind of test to determine worthiness, and the performing of difficult weaves under stress strikes me as fulfilling that need. I didn't mean that, Nynaeve said. I mean the system that determines how we are treated by each other. Daigyan flushed. It was inappropriate to refer to another's power in any way. But, well, Nynaeve had never been very good at conforming to other people's expectations, particularly when they expected foolishness. There you sit, she said, knowing as much as any other Aes Sedai, knowing more than many, I'd wager. And the moment any accepted just off apron strings gains the shawl, you have to do what she says.
Need a new TV.
Daigyan's blush deepened.
I'll be right back.
We should move on. It just wasn't right. Nynaeve let the matter drop, however. She'd stepped in this particular pit once before in teaching the kinswomen to stand up for themselves in front of Aes Sedai. Before long, they'd been standing up to Nynaeve, too, which had not been her intention. She wasn't certain she wanted to attempt a similar revolution among the Aes Sedai themselves. She tried to turn back to the tutoring, but that sense of an impending storm kept drawing her eyes to the window. The room was on the second floor and had a good view of the camp outside. It was by pure happenstance that Nynaeve caught a glimpse of Kedswain. That gray bun set with innocent-looking ter'angreal was obvious even from a distance. The woman was crossing the courtyard, Coreel at her side, walking at a fair clip. What is she doing? Nynaeve wondered. Swain's pace made her suspicious. What had happened? Something to do with Rand? If that man had gotten himself hurt again... Excuse me, Daigyan, Nynaeve said, standing. I just remembered something that I must see to. The other woman started. Oh, well, all right then, Nynaeve. We can continue another time, I suppose. It wasn't until Nynaeve had hurried out the door and down the stairs that she realized Daigyan had actually used her name. She smiled as she walked out onto the green. There were Aiel in the camp. That itself wasn't uncommon. Rand often had a complement of maidens to act as guards. But these Aiel were men, wearing the dusty brown cut-in-sore and carrying spears at their sides. A fair number of them wore the headbands bearing Rand's symbol on them. That was why Cadsuane had been in such a hurry. If the Aiel clan chiefs had arrived, then Rand would be wanting to meet with them. Nynaeve strode across the green, which wasn't very green at all, in a huff. Rand hadn't sent for her. Probably not because he didn't want to include her, but because he was just too wool-headed to think of it. Dragon Reborn or not, the man rarely thought to share his plans with others. She would have thought that after all this time, he would have realized the importance of getting advice from someone a little more experienced than he. How many times now had he gotten himself kidnapped, wounded, or imprisoned because of his rashness? All these others in camp might bow and scrape and dote on him, but Nynaeve knew that he was really just a sheep herder from Emmons Field. He still got into trouble the same way he had when he and Matrim had pulled pranks as boys. Only now, instead of flustering the village girls, he could throw entire nations into chaos. On the far northern side of the green, directly opposite the manor house, close to the front of the bulwark, the Aiel newcomers were setting up their camp, complete with tan tents. They arranged them differently than the Saldeans. Instead of straight rows, the Aiel preferred small groups, organized by society. Some of Bashir's men called greetings to passing Aiel, but none moved to help. Aiel could be a prickly bunch, and while Nynaeve found the Saldeans to be far less irrational than most, they were borderlanders. Skirmishes with Aiel had been a way of life for them in earlier years, and the Aiel War itself was not so distant. For now, they all fought on the same side, but that didn't keep the Saldeans from stepping a little more carefully, now that the Aiel had arrived in force. Nynaeve scanned for signs of Rand or any Aiel she knew. She doubted that Avienda would be with the group. She would be back in Camelin with Elaine, helping secure the throne of Andor. Nynaeve still felt guilty for leaving them, but somebody had needed to help Rand cleanse Sidene. That wasn't the sort of thing you left him to do alone. Now where was he? Nynaeve stopped at the boundary between the Saldeans and the new Aiel camp. Soldiers carrying lances nodded to her in respect. Aiel in brown and green glided across the grass, their motions smooth as water. Women in blues and greens carried wash from the stream beside the manor house. Broad-needled pines shivered in the wind. The camp bustled like the village green at Bel Tine. Which way had Cadsuane gone? She sensed channeling in the northeast. Nynaeve smiled, setting off with a determined step, yellow skirt swishing. The channeling would either be an Aes Sedai or a wise one. Sure enough, she soon saw a larger Aiel tent erected at the corner of the green. She strode straight for it, her stares, or perhaps her reputation, encouraging Saldean soldiers to get out of her way. The maidens guarding the entrance did not try to stop her. Rand stood inside wearing black and red, leafing through maps on a sturdy wooden table, his left arm held behind his back. Bashir stood at his side, nodding to himself and studying a small map he held before him. Rand looked up as Nynaeve entered. When had he started looking so much like a warder, with that instant glance of assessment? Those eyes picked out every threat, body tense as if expecting an attack at any time. I should never have let that woman take him from the 2 rivers, she thought. Look what it's done to him. She immediately frowned at her own foolishness. If Rand had stayed in the 2 rivers, he would have gone mad and perhaps destroyed them all. assuming, of course, the Trollocs, the Fades, or the Forsaken themselves hadn't accomplished the task first. If Moiraine hadn't come for Rand, he'd now be dead. With him would have gone the light and hope of the world. It was just hard to abandon her old prejudices. Ah, Nynaeve, Rand said, relaxing and turning back to his maps. He motioned for Bashir to inspect one of them, then turned back to her. I was about to send for you. Ruark and Bale are here. Nynaeve raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. Oh? She asked flatly. And here I'd assumed that all the Aiel in the camp meant we had been attacked by Shido. His face hardened at her tone, and those eyes of his grew dangerous. But then he lightened, shaking his head, almost as if to clear it. Some of the old Rand, the Rand who had been an innocent sheep herder, seemed to return.
Gooey at the end.
Yes, of course you would have noticed, he said. I'm glad you were here. We will begin as soon as the clan chiefs return. I insisted they see their people settled before we began. He waved for her to sit. There were cushions on the floor, but no chairs. Aiel spurned those, and Rand would want them to be comfortable. Nynaeve eyed him, surprised at how tight her own nerves had become. He was just a wool-headed villager, no matter how much influence he'd found. He was. But she could not shake away that look in his eyes, that flash of anger. Holding a crown was said to change many men for the worse. She intended to see that didn't happen to Rand al'Thor, but what recourse would she have if he suddenly decided to have her imprisoned? He wouldn't do that, would he? Not Rand. Semirag said he was mad, Nynaeve thought. Said that he heard voices from his past life.
Down.
Is that what is happening when he cocks his head? As if listening to things that nobody else can hear? She shivered. Min was there in the tent, of course, sitting and reading a book in the corner. The Wake of the Breaking. Min looked too intently at the pages. She'd listened to the exchange between Rand and Nynaeve. What did she think of the changes in him? She was closer to him than anyone. Close enough that if they'd all been back in Emond's Field, Nynaeve would have given the two of them a tongue-lashing strong enough to make their heads spin. Even though they weren't in Emond's Field and she was no longer Wisdom, she'd made certain that Rand knew of her displeasure. His response had been simple. If I marry her, my death will bring her even more pain. More idiocy, of course. If you were planning to go into danger, then it was all the more reason to get married. Obviously. Nynaeve seated herself on the floor, arranging her skirts, and pointedly did not think of Lan. He had such a long distance to cover, and she had to make sure that she was given his bond before he reached the Blight, just in case. Suddenly she sat upright. Catswain. The woman wasn't there. Besides guards, the tent contained only Rand, Nynaeve, Min, and Bashir. Was she off planning something that Nynaeve... Catswain entered. The gray-haired Aes Sedai wore a simple tan dress. She relied on presence, not clothing, to draw attention. And of course her hair sparkled with its golden ornaments. Coriel followed her in. Catswain wove a ward against eavesdropping, and Rand did not object. He should stick up for himself more. That woman practically had him tamed, and it was unsettling how much he let her get away with. Like questioning Semirag. The Forsaken were far too powerful and dangerous to treat lightly. Semirag should have been stilled the moment they captured her. Though Nynaeve's opinion in that regard was directly related to her own experience in keeping Moghedien captive. Coriel gave Nynaeve a smile. She tended to have one of those for everyone. Catswain, as usual, ignored Nynaeve. That was fine. Nynaeve had no need for her approval. Catswain thought she could order everyone around just because she'd outlived every other Aes Sedai. Well, Nynaeve knew for a fact that age had little to do with wisdom. Sen Bui had been as old as rain, but had about as much sense as a pile of rocks. Many of the camp's other Aes Sedai and camp leaders trickled into the tent over the next few minutes. Perhaps Rand really had sent messengers, and would have called for Nynaeve. The newcomers included Maurice and her warders, one of whom was the Ashaman, Jahar Narishma, bells tinkling on the ends of his braids. Dahmer Flynn, Elza Penfell, a few of Bashir's officers also arrived. Rand glanced up when each one entered, alert and wary, but he quickly turned back to his maps. Was he growing paranoid? Some madmen grew suspicious of everyone. Eventually, Ruark and Vale made their appearance, along with several other Aiel. They stalked through the tent's large entrance like cats on the prowl. In an odd turn, a batch of wise ones, whom Nynaeve had been able to sense when they got close, were among the group. Often, with Aiel, an event was either considered clan chief business or wise one business, much as things happened back in the Two Rivers with the village council and the women's circle. Had Rand asked for them all to attend, or had they decided to come together for reasons of their own? Nynaeve had been wrong about Avienda's location. She was shocked to see the tall, red-haired woman hovering at the back of the group of wise ones. When had she left Camelin? And why was she carrying that worn cloth with a frayed edge? Nynaeve didn't get a chance to ask Avienda any questions, as Rand nodded to Ruark and the others, motioning for them to sit, which they did. Rand himself remained standing beside his map table. He placed his arms behind his back, hand clasping Stump, a thoughtful look on his face. He offered no preamble. "Tell me of your work in Arad Doman," he said to Ruark. "My scouts inform me that this land is hardly at peace." Ruark accepted a cup of tea from Avienda, so she was still considered an apprentice, and turned to Rand. The clan chief did not drink. "We have had very little time, Rand al'Thor." "I don't look for excuses, Ruark," Rand said. "Only results." This brought flashes of anger to the faces of several of the other Aiel, and the maidens at the doorway exchanged a furious burst of hand signals. Ruark himself displayed no anger, though Nynaeve did think his hand tightened on his cup. "I've shared water with you, Rand al'Thor," he said. "I would not think that you would bring me here to offer insults." "No insults, Ruark," Rand said. "Just truths. We don't have time to waste." "No time, Rand al'Thor?" Vale said. The clan chief of the Goshin Aiel was a very tall man, and he seemed to tower even when sitting down. "You left many of us in Andor for months with nothing to do but polish spears and scare wetlanders. Now you send us to this land with impossible orders, then follow a few weeks later and demand results?" "You were in Andor to help Elaine," Rand said. "She did not want or need help," Vale said with a snort. "And she was right to refuse aid. I'd rather run across the entire waste with a single skin of water than have leadership of my clan handed to me by another." Rand's expression grew dark again, his eyes stormy, and Nynaeve was again reminded of the tempest brewing to the north. "The land is broken, Rand al'Thor," Ruark said, his voice calmer than Vale's. "It is not making excuses to explain that fact, and it is not cowardice to be cautious about a difficult task." "We must have peace here," Rand growled. "If you can't manage..." "Boy," Cadsuane said. "Perhaps you want to stop and think.
I'll be right back.
How often have you known the Aiel to fail you? How often have you failed, hurt, or offended them?" Rand snapped his mouth closed, and Nynaeve gritted her teeth at not having spoken up herself. She glanced at Cadsuane, who had been given a chair to sit upon. Nynaeve couldn't recall ever seeing her sit on the floor. The chair had obviously been taken from the manor. It was constructed from pale Elgilrin horns, which stretched out like open palms and had a red cushion. Avienda handed Cadsuane a cup of tea, which she sipped carefully. With obvious effort, Rand pulled his temper back under control. "I apologize, Ruark. Vale. It has been a wearing few months." "You have no toe," Ruark said. "But please sit. Let us share shade and speak with civility. Rand sighed audibly, then nodded, seating himself before the other two. The several wise ones in attendance, Amis, Mylane, Bear, didn't seem inclined to participate in the discussion. They were observers, much, Nynaeve realized, as she herself was. We must have peace in Ara Doman, my friends, Rand said, unrolling a map between them on the tent rug. Bale shook his head. Dobrain Taborwin has done well with Bandar Eben, he said. But Ruark spoke rightly when he called this land broken. It is like a piece of sea-folk porcelain dropped from the tip of a high mountain. You told us to discover who was in charge and see if we could restore order. Well, as far as we can tell, no one is in charge. Each city has been left to fend for itself. What if the Council of Merchants, Bashir said, sitting down with them, knuckling his mustache as he studied the map. My scouts say they still hold some measure of power. In the cities where they rule, this is true, Ruark said, but their influence is weak. There's only one member still in the capital, and she has little control there. We have stopped the fighting in the streets, but only with great effort. He shook his head. This is what comes from trying to control more lands than Holds and Clan. Without their kin, these Domani do not know who is in charge. Where is he? Rand asked. Nobody knows, Rand al'Thor. He vanished. Some say months ago. Others say it has been years. Grendal might have him, Rand whispered, studying the map intently. If she's here. Yes, I think she probably is. But where? She won't be in the king's palace. That's not her way. She will have some place that is hers, a place where she can display her trophies, a location that would make a trophy itself, but not a place that one would think of immediately. Yes, I know. You're right. That's how she did it before. Such familiarity. Nynaeve shivered. Avienda knelt beside her, holding out a cup of tea. Nynaeve took it, meeting the woman's eyes, and began to whisper a question. Avienda shook her head curtly. Later, her expression seemed to imply. Avienda rose and retreated to the back of the room, and then, grimacing, took out her frayed cloth and began pulling the threads out, one at a time. What was the point of that? Cadsuane, Rand said, stopping his whispering, speaking up. What do you know of the Council of Merchants? They're mostly women, Cadsuane said, and women of great cunning at that. However, they are also a selfish lot. It is their duty to choose the king, and with Al-Salam's disappearance, they should have found a replacement. Too many of them see this as an opportunity, and that keeps them from reaching an agreement. I can assume that they've separated in face of this chaos to secure power in their home cities, fighting for position and alliances as they each offer their own choice of king for the others to consider. And this Domani army fighting the Shanchan? Rand asked. Is that their doing? I know nothing of that. You speak of the man Rodel Ituralda, Ruark said. Yes. He fought well 20 years ago, Ruark said, rubbing his square chin. He is of the ones you call a great captain. I should like to dance the spears with him. You will not, Rand said sharply. Not while I live, at least. We will secure this land. And you expect us to do this without fighting? Vale asked. This Rodel Ituralda reportedly fights like a sandstorm against the Shanchan, drawing their ire better even than you yourself, Rand al'Thor. He will not sleep while you conquer his homeland. Once again, Rand said, we are not here to conquer. Ruark sighed. Then why send us, Rand al'Thor? Why not use your Aes Sedai? They understand wetlanders. This country is like an entire kingdom of children. We are too few adults to bring them to obedience, particularly if you forbid us to spank them. You can fight, Rand said, but only when you need to. Ruark, this has gone beyond the ability of Aes Sedai to fix. You can do this. People are intimidated by the Aiel. They will do as you say. If we can stop the Damani war with the Shanchan, perhaps this daughter of the Nine Moons will see that I am serious in my desire for peace. Then maybe she'll agree to meet with me. Why not do as you've done before? Bale asked. Seize the land for your own. Bashir nodded, glancing at Rand. It won't work. Not this time, Rand said. A war here would take too many resources. You spoke of this Ituralda. He's holding off the Shanchan with virtually no supplies and few men. Would you have us engage a man that resourceful? How thoughtful Bashir seemed, as if he were indeed considering engaging this Ituralda. Men. They were all the same. Offer them a challenge and they'd be curious, no matter that the challenge would likely end with them spitted on a lance. There are few men alive like Rodel Ituralda, Bashir said. He would be a great help to our cause, for certain. I've always wondered if I could beat him. No, Rand said again, looking over the map. From what Nynaeve could see, it showed troop concentrations marked with annotations. The Aiel were an organized mess of charcoal marks across the top of Arad Doman. Ituralda's forces were deep into Almoth Plain, fighting Shanchan. The middle of Arad Doman was a sea of chaotic black annotations, likely the personal forces of various nobles. Ruark, Bale, Rand said. I want you to seize the members of the Council of Merchants. The tent was silent. Are you certain that is wise, boy? Cadsuane finally asked. They're in danger from the Forsaken, Rand said, idly tapping the map with his fingers. If Grandal really has taken Al-Salam, then getting him back will do us no good. He'll be so far beneath her compulsion that he'll barely have the mind of a child. She's not subtle. She never has been. We need the Council of Merchants to choose a new king. That's the only way to bring this kingdom peace and order. Bashir nodded. It's bold. We're not kidnappers, Bale said, frowning. You are what I say you are, Bale, Rand said quietly. We are still free people, Rand al-Tholar, Ruark said. I will change the Aiel with my passing, Rand said with a shake of his head. I don't know what you'll be once this is all through, but you cannot remain what you were. I will have you take up this task. Of all those who follow me, I trust you the most. If we're going to take the members of the council without throwing this land further into war, I will need your cunning and stealth. You can prowl into their palaces and manors as you infiltrated the Stone of Tyr. Ruark and Bale regarded one another, sharing a frown. Once you take the Council of Merchants, Rand continued, apparently unconcerned about their worries, move the Aiel into the cities where those merchants ruled. Make sure those cities don't degenerate. Restore order as you did in Bandar Eben. From there begin hunting bandits and enforcing the law. Supplies will soon arrive from the sea folk. Take cities on the coast first, then move inland. Within a month's time, the Damani should be flowing toward you, rather than running away from you. Offer them safety and food, and order will take care of itself. A surprisingly rational plan. Rand really did have a clever mind for a man. There was a lot of good in him, perhaps the very soul of a leader, if he could keep his temper in check. Ruark continued to rub his chin. It would help if we had some of your Saldaeans, Davram Bashir. Wetlanders do not like following Aiel. If they can pretend that Wetlanders are in charge, then they will be more likely to come to us. Bashir laughed. We'll also make nice targets. As soon as we seize a few members of the Merchant Council, the rest will send assassins after us for certain. Ruark laughed as if he thought that a grand joke. The Aiel sense of humor was its own sort of oddity. We will keep you alive, Davram Bashir. If we do not, we will stuff you and set you on that horse of yours, and you will make a grand quiver for their arrows. Vale laughed loudly at this. and the maidens by the doors began another round of hand talk. Bashir chuckled, though he didn't seem to understand the humor either. "You sure this is what you want to do?" he asked Rand. Rand nodded. "Divide some of your forces. Send them with Aiel groups as Ruark decides." "And what of Aitoralda?" Bashir asked, looking back at the map. "There won't be peace for long once he realizes we've invaded his homeland." Rand tapped the map softly for a moment. "I will deal with him personally," he finally said. Chapter 8. Clean Shirts. A dockmaster's sky, it was called. Those gray clouds blotting out the sun, temperamental and sullen. Perhaps the others, here in the camp just outside of Tarvalon, hadn't noticed the persistent clouds, but Swan had. No sailor would miss them. Not dark enough to promise a storm, not light enough to imply smooth waters either. A sky like that was ambiguous. You could set out and never see a drop of rain or a hint of storm winds, or with barely a moment's notice you could find yourself in the middle of a squall. It was deceitful, that blanket of clouds. Most ports charged a daily fee to each vessel moored in their harbors, but on days of storm, when no fisher could make a catch, the fee would be halved or spared entirely. On a day like this, however, when there were gloomy clouds but no proof of storms, the dockmasters would charge a full day's rent. And so the fisher had to make a choice. Stay in the harbor and wait, or go fishing to recoup the dock fees. Most days like this didn't turn stormy. Most days like this were safe. But if a storm did come on a day like this, it tended to be very bad. Many of the most terrible tempests in history had sprung from a dockmaster's sky. That's why some fishers had another name for clouds like those. They called them a lionfish's veil. And it had been days since the sky had offered anything different. Swan shivered, pulling her shawl close. It was a bad sign. She doubted many fishers had chosen to go out this day. "Swan," Lilane asked, voice tinged with annoyance. "Do hurry up. And I don't want to hear any more superstitious nonsense about the sky. Honestly." The tall Aes Sedai turned away and continued along the walk. "Superstitious?" Swan thought indignantly. 1,000 generations of wisdom isn't superstition. It's good sense. But she said nothing and hurried after Lilane. Around her, the camp of Aes Sedai loyal to Egwene continued its daily activities, as steady as a clock's gears. If there was one thing Aes Sedai were good at, it was creating order. Tents were arranged in clusters by Adja, as if to imitate the White Tower's layout. There were few men, and most of those who passed, soldiers on errands from Gareth Bryn's armies, grooms caring for horses, were quick to be about their duties. They were far outnumbered by worker women, many of whom had gone so far as to embroider the pattern of the flame of Tarvalon on their skirts or bodices. One of the only oddities about the village, if one ignored the fact that there were tents instead of rooms and wooden walkways instead of tiled hallways, was the number of novices. There were hundreds and hundreds. In fact, the number had to be over 1,000 now, many more than the tower had held in recent memory. Once the Aes Sedai were reunited, novices' quarters that hadn't been used in decades would have to be reopened. They might even need the second kitchen. These novices bustled around in families, and most of the Aes Sedai tried to ignore them. Some did this out of habit, who paid attention to novices, but others did so out of displeasure. By their estimation, women aged enough to be mothers and grandmothers, indeed many who were mothers and grandmothers, shouldn't have been entered into the novice book. But what could be done? Egwene Alvir, the Amerlin seat, had declared that it should happen. Swan could still sense shock in some of the Aes Sedai she passed. Egwene was to have been carefully controlled. What had gone wrong? When had the Amerlin gotten away from them? Swan would have taken more smug delight from those looks if she hadn't herself worried about Egwene's continued captivity in the White Tower. That was a lionfish's veil indeed, potential for great success, but also for great disaster. She hurried after Lelaine. "What is the status of the negotiations?" Lelaine asked, not bothering to look at Swan. You could go to one of the sessions yourself and find out, Swan thought. But Lelaine wanted to be seen supervising, not taking an active hand, and asking Swan in the open was also a calculated move. Swan was known as one of Egwene's confidants and still carried some measure of notoriety for having been Amerlin herself. The things Swan said to Lelaine weren't important. Being seen saying them, however, increased the woman's influence in camp. "They don't go well, Lelaine," Swan said. "Elida's emissaries never promise anything, and seem indignant any time we raise important topics, like reinstating the Blue Aja. I doubt they have any real authority from Elida to make binding agreements." Lelaine said thoughtfully, nodding to a group of novices. They bobbed into curtsies. In a shrewd decision, Lelaine had begun talking very acceptingly of the new novices. Romanda's dislike of them was well known. Now that Egwene was gone, Romonda had begun to imply that once reconciliation was achieved, this foolishness with the aged novices would have to be dealt with swiftly. However, more and more of the other sisters were seeing Egwene's wisdom. There was great strength among the new novices, and not a few would be raised to accepted the moment the White Tower was achieved. Recently, by offering tacit acceptance of these women, Lelaine had given herself yet another tie to Egwene. Swan eyed the retreating family of novices. They had curtsied to Lelaine almost as quickly and deferentially as they would have to the Amerlin. It was becoming clear that after months at a stalemate, Lelaine was winning the battle against Ramonda for superiority. And that was a very large problem. Swan didn't dislike Lelaine. She was capable, strong-willed, and decisive. They had been friends once, though their relationship had changed drastically with Swan's changed position. Yes, she might say she liked Lelaine, but she didn't trust the woman, and she particularly didn't want to see her as Amerlin. In another era, Lelaine would have done well in the position, but this world needed Egwene, and friendship or not, Swan couldn't afford to let this woman displace the rightful Amerlin, and she had to make certain Lelaine wasn't taking action to prevent Egwene's return. "Well," Lelaine said, "we shall have to discuss the negotiations in the hall. The Amerlin wants them to continue, so we certainly can't let them stop. Yet there must be a way to make them effective. The Amerlin's desires must be seen to, wouldn't you say?" "Undoubtedly," Swan replied flatly. Lelaine eyed her, and Swan cursed herself for letting her emotions show. Lelaine needed to believe that Swan was on her side. "I'm sorry, Lelaine. That woman has me in a fury. Why does Elida hold talks if she won't concede a single point?" Lelaine nodded. "Yes, but who can say why Elida does what she does? The Amerlin's reports indicate that Elida's leadership of the tower has been
That was a good
erratic, at best." Swan simply nodded. Fortunately, Lelaine didn't seem to suspect Swan's disloyalty, or she didn't care about it. It was remarkable how innocuous the women thought Swan was, now that her power had been so greatly reduced. Being weak was a new experience. From her very early days in the White Tower, sisters had noted her strength and her sharpness of mind. Whispers of her becoming Amerlin had begun almost immediately. At times it seemed that the pattern itself had pushed Swan directly into the seat. Though her hasty ascent to Amerlin while so young had come as a surprise to many, she herself had not been shocked. When you fished with squid as bait, you shouldn't be surprised to catch fangfish. If you wanted to catch eels, you used something else entirely. When she'd first been healed, her reduced power had been a disappointment, but that was changing. Yes, it was infuriating to be beneath so many, to lack respect from those around her. However, because she was weaker in power, many seemed to assume she was weaker in political skill as well. Could people really forget so quickly? She was finding her new status among the Aes Sedai to be liberating. Yes, Lillian said as she nodded to another group of novices. I believe that it is time to send envoys to the kingdoms that Althor hasn't conquered. We may not hold the White Tower itself, but that is no reason to abandon our political stewardship of the world. Yes, Lillian, Swan said. But are you certain that Ramonda won't argue against that? Why would she? Lillian said dismissively. It wouldn't make sense. Little Ramonda does make sense, Swan said. I think she disagrees just to spite you. But I did see her chatting with Maralenda earlier in the week. Lillian frowned. Maralenda was a distant cousin to the Tracand line. Swan covered a smile. It was amazing how much you could accomplish when people dismissed you. How many women had she dismissed because they lacked visible power? How often had she been manipulated, much as she now manipulated Lillian? I shall look into it, Lillian said. It didn't matter what she discovered. As long as she was kept busy worrying about Ramonda, she wouldn't be able to spend as much time stealing power from Egwene. Egwene. The Amerlin needed to hurry up and finish with her plotting in the White Tower. What good would it do to undermine Elida if the Aes Sedai outside crumbled while Egwene wasn't watching? Swan could only keep Ramonda and Lillian distracted for so long, particularly now that Lillian held such a distinct advantage. Light. Some days she felt that she was trying to juggle buttered live silver pike. Swan checked the position of the sun behind that Dark Master's sky. It was late afternoon. Fish guts, she muttered. I'll need to be going, Lillian. Lillian glanced at her. You have washing, I presume, for that ruffian of a general of yours? He's not a ruffian, Swan snapped, then cursed herself. She'd lose much of her advantage if she kept snapping at those who thought themselves her betters. Lillian smiled, eyes twinkling as if she knew something special. Insufferable woman. Friend or not, Swan had half a mind to wipe. No. I apologize, Lillian, Swan forced out. I get on edge thinking of what that man demands of me. Yes, Lillian said, down-turning her lips. I've considered on this, Swan. The Amerlin may have suffered Bryn's bullying of a sister, but I won't stand for it. You're one of my attendants now. One of your attendants? Swan thought. I thought that I was just supposed to support you until Egwene returned. Yes, Lillian mused. I should think it's time to put an end to your servitude to Bryn. I shall pay off your debt, Swan. Pay off my debt? Swan said, feeling a moment of panic. Is that wise? Not that I wouldn't mind being free of that man, of course. But my position offers me quite useful opportunities for listening in on his plans. Plans? Lillian asked, frowning. Swan cringed inwardly. The last thing she wanted was to imply wrongdoing on Bryn's part. Light, the man was strict enough to make warders look sloppy in keeping their oaths. She should just let Lillian end this foolish servitude, but the thought made her stomach churn. Bryn was already disappointed that she'd broken her oath to him months before. Well, she hadn't broken that oath. She'd just postponed her period of service. Try convincing the stubborn fool of that fact. If she took the easy way out now, what would he think of her? He'd think that he'd won, that she'd proven herself unable to keep her word. There was no way she'd let that happen. Besides, she wasn't about to let Lillian be the one who freed her. That would just move her debt from Bryn to Lillian. The Aes Sedai would collect it in far more subtle ways, but each coin would end up being paid one way or another, if only through demands of loyalty. Lillian, Swan said softly, I don't suspect the good general of anything. However, he controls our armies. Can you really be trusted to do as required without any supervision? Lelaine sniffed. I'm not certain any man can be trusted without direction. I hate doing his laundry, Swan said. Well, she did, even if she wouldn't be stopped from doing it for all of the gold in Tarvalon. But if the duty keeps me close with a listening ear... Yes, Lelaine said, nodding slowly. Yes, I see that you are right. I will not forget your sacrifice, Swan. Very well. You are dismissed. Lelaine turned, glancing down at her hand as if longing for something, probably wishing for the day when, as Amerlin, she could offer her great serpent ring for a kiss when she parted ways with another sister. Light, but Egwene needed to return soon. Buttered silver pike. Buttered flaming silver pike. Swan made her way toward the edge of the Aes Sedai camp. Bryn's army surrounded the Aes Sedai camp in a large ring, but she was on the far side of the ring from Bryn. It would take a good half-hour to walk to his command post. Fortunately, she found a wagon driver who was taking a load of supplies brought through a gateway to the army. The short, grizzled man immediately agreed to let her ride with the turnips, though he did seem puzzled why she didn't go get a horse, as befitted an Aes Sedai station. Well, it wasn't that far, and riding with vegetables was a fate far less undignified than being forced to jounce around on the back of a horse. If Gareth Bryn wanted to complain about her tardiness, then he'd get an earful, he would. She settled back against a lumpy sack of turnips, brown-skirted legs hanging over the back of the wagon. As the cart rolled up a slight incline, she could see over the Aes Sedai camp, with its white tents and city-like organization. Ringed around it was the army, with smaller tents in neat straight lines, and ringed around them was a growing ring of camp followers. Beyond it all, the landscape was brown, the winter snows melted, but spring sprouts scarce. The countryside was pocketed with thickets of scrub oak. Shadows in valleys and twisting lines of chimney smoke pointed to distant villages. It was surprising how familiar, how welcome these grasslands felt. When she had first come to the White Tower, she'd been sure she'd never come to love this landlocked countryside. Now she had lived much more of her life in Tarvalon than she had in Tyr. It was difficult at times to recall that girl who had sewn nets and gone on early morning trawling trips with her father. She'd become something else, a woman who traded in secrets rather than fish. Secrets, those powerful, dominating secrets. They had become her life. No love save for youthful dalliances, no time for entanglements, or much room for friendships. She'd focused on only one thing, finding the dragon reborn, helping him, guiding him, hopefully controlling him. Moiraine had died following that same quest, but at least she had been able to go out and see the world. Swan had grown old, in spirit if not in body, cooped up in the tower, pulling her strings and nudging the world. She'd done some good. Time would tell if those efforts had been enough. She didn't regret her life, yet at this moment, passing army tents, holes and broken ruts in the path, shaking the cart, making it rattle like dried fish bones in a kettle, she envied Moiraine. How often had Swan bothered to look out of her window toward the beautiful green landscape before it all had started going sickly? She and Moiraine had fought so hard to save this world, but they had left themselves without anything to enjoy in it. Perhaps Swan had made a mistake in staying with the Blue, unlike Lyanna, who had taken the opportunity in their stilling and healing to change to the Green Aja. No, Swan thought, wagon rattling, smelling of bitter turnips. No, I'm still focused on saving this blasted world. There would be no switching to the green for her. Though, thinking of Bryn, she did wish that the blue were a little more like the green in certain ways. Swan the Amerlin hadn't had any time for entanglements, but what of Swan the attendant? Guiding people with quiet manipulations required a lot more skill than bullying them with the power of the Amerlin seat. and it was proving more fulfilling. But it also left her without the crushing weight of responsibility she'd felt during her years leading the White Tower. Was there, perhaps, room in her life for a few more changes? The wagon reached the far side of the army camp, and she shook her head at her own foolishness as she hopped down, then nodded her thanks to the wagon driver.
I'll be right back.
Was she a girl, barely old enough for her first full-day blackfish trawl? There was no use in thinking of Bryn that way. At least not right now. There was too much to do. She walked along the perimeter of the camp, army tents to her left. It was growing dark, and lanterns burning precious oil illuminated disorganized shanties and tents to her right. Ahead of her, a small circular palisade rose on the army side. It didn't enclose the entire army. In fact, it was only big enough for several dozen officer tents and some larger command tents. It was to act as a fortification in an emergency, but always as a center of operations. Bryn felt it good to have a physical barrier separating the larger camp from the place where he held conference with his officers. With the confusion of the civilian camp, and with such a long border to patrol, it would be too easy for spies to approach his tents otherwise. The palisade was only about 3/4 done, but the work was progressing quickly. Perhaps he would choose to surround the entire army eventually, if the siege continued long enough. For now, Bryn felt that the small fortified command post would not only suggest security to the soldiers, but also lend them a sense of authority. The 8-foot wooden stakes rose from the ground ahead, a line of sentinels standing side by side, points raised to the sky. While holding a siege, one generally had a lot of manpower for work like this. The guards at the palisade gate knew to let her pass, and she quickly made her way to Bryn's tent. She did have washing to do, but most of it would probably have to wait until the morning. She was supposed to meet Egwene in Tel Riyadh as soon as it grew dark, and the glow of the sunset was already beginning to fade. Bryn's tent, as usual, shone with only a very faint light. While people outside squandered their oil, he scrimped. Most of his men lived better than he did. Fool man. Swan pushed her way into the tent without calling. If he was foolish enough to change without going behind the screen, then he was foolish enough to be seen doing it. He was seated at his desk, working by the light of a solitary candle. He appeared to be reading scout reports. Swan sniffed, letting the tent flaps droop closed behind her. Not a single lamp. That man. You will ruin your eyes reading by such poor light, Gareth Bryn. I have read by the light of a single candle for most of my life, Swan, he said, turning over a page and not looking up. And I'll have you know that my eyesight is the same as it was when I was a boy. Oh, Swan said. So you're saying that your eyesight was poor to begin with? Bryn grinned, but continued his reading. Swan sniffed again, loudly, to make sure he heard. Then she wove a globe of light and sent it hovering over beside his desk. Fool man. She wouldn't have him going so blind he fell in battle to an attack he didn't see. After setting the light beside his head, perhaps too close for him to be comfortable with it without scooting over, she walked over to pluck clothing off the drying line she'd strung across the center of the tent. He'd voiced no complaint about her using the inside of his tent for drying laundry, and hadn't taken it down. That was a disappointment. She'd been anticipating chastising him for that. A woman from the camp outside approached me today, Bryn said, shifting his chair to the side, then picking up another stack of pages. She offered me laundry service. She's organizing a group of washwomen in the camp, and she claimed that she could do my wash more quickly and effectively than a single distracted maidservant could. Swan froze, sparing a glance at Bryn, who was looking through his papers. His strong jaw was lit on the left by the even white light of her globe, and on the right by the flickering orange candlelight. Some men were made weak by age. Others were made to look tired or slovenly. Bryn had simply become distinguished, like a pillar crafted by a master stonemason, then left to the elements. Age hadn't reduced Bryn's effectiveness or his strength. It had simply given him character, dusting his temples with silver, creasing his firm face with lines of wisdom. "And what did you tell this woman?" she asked. Bryn turned the page over. "I told her that I was satisfied with my laundry." He looked up at her. "I have to say, Swan, that I'm surprised. I had assumed that an Aes Sedai would know little of work such as this, but rarely have my uniforms known such a perfect combination of stiffness and comfort. You are to be commended." Swan turned away from him, hiding her blush. Fool man. She had caused kings to kneel before her. She manipulated the Aes Sedai and planned for the deliverance of mankind itself. And he complimented her on her laundering skills? The thing was, from Bryn, that was an honest and meaningful compliment. He didn't look down on washwomen or on runner boys. He treated all with equity. A person didn't gain stature in Gareth Bryn's eyes by being a king or queen. One gained stature by keeping to one's oaths and doing one's duty. To him, a compliment on laundry well done was as meaningful as a medal awarded to a soldier who had stood his ground before the enemy. She glanced back at him. He was still watching her. Fool man. She hurriedly took down another of his shirts and began folding it. "You never did explain to my satisfaction why you broke your oath," he said. Swan froze, looking at the back wall of the tent, splayed with shadows of the still hanging laundry. "I thought that you understood," she said, continuing to fold. "I had important information for the Aes Sedai in Saladar. Besides, I couldn't very well let Logain run about free, now could I? I had to find him and get him to Saladar." "Those are excuses," Bryn said. "Oh, I know that they're true, but you're Aes Sedai. You can cite 4 facts and use them to hide the real truth as effectively as another might use lies." "So you claim I'm a liar?" she demanded. "No," he said. "Just an oath breaker." She glanced at him, eyes widening. Why, she'd let him hear the rough side of... She hesitated. He was watching her, bathed in the glow of the 2 lights, eyes thoughtful, reserved, but not accusatory. "That question drove me here, you know," he said. "It's why I hunted you all that way. It's why I finally swore to these rebel Aes Sedai, though I had little wish to be pulled into yet another war at Tarvalin. I did it all because I needed to understand. I had to know. Why? Why did the woman with those eyes, those passionate, haunting eyes, break her oath?" "I told you I was going to return to you and fulfill that oath," Swan said, turning away from him and snapping a shirt in front of her to unwrinkle it. "Another excuse," he said softly. "Another answer from an Aes Sedai. Will I ever have the full truth from you, Swan Sanche? Has anyone ever had it?" He sighed, and she heard papers rustle, the candle's light flickering in the faint stir of his movements as he turned back to his reports. "When I was still unaccepted in the White Tower," Swan said softly. "I was one of 4 people present when a foretelling announced the imminent birth of the dragon reborn on the slopes of Dragonmount." His rustling froze. "One of the 2 others present," Swan continued, "died on the spot. The other died soon after. I'm confident that she, the Amarlin Seat herself, was murdered by the Black Aja. Yes, it exists. If you tell anyone that I admitted that fact, I'll have your tongue. Anyway, before she died, the Amarlin sent Aes Sedai out hunting the dragon. One by one, those women vanished. The Blacks must have tortured their names out of Tamra before killing her. She would not have given up those names easily. I still shiver sometimes thinking about what she must have gone through. Soon there were just the 2 of us left who knew, Warren and me. We weren't supposed to hear the foretelling. We were just accepted, in the room by happenstance. I believe that Tamra was somehow able to withhold our names from the Blacks, for if she hadn't, we'd have undoubtedly been murdered like the others. That left 2 of us, the only 2 in all of the world who knew what was coming, at least the only 2 who served the light. And so I did what I had to do, Gareth Bryn. I dedicated my life to preparing for the dragon's coming. I swore to see us through the last battle, to do whatever was necessary, to bear the burden I had been given. There was only one other person I knew I could trust, and she is now dead. Swan turned, meeting his eyes across the tent. A breeze rippled the walls and fluttered the candle, but Bryn sat still, watching her. So you see, Gareth Bryn, she said, I had to delay fulfilling my oath to you because of other oaths. I swore to see this through to the end, and the dragon has not yet met his destiny at Sheol Ghul. A person's oaths must follow their order of importance. When I swore to you, I did not promise to serve you immediately. I was intentionally careful on that point. You will call it an Aes Sedai wordplay. I would call it something else. Which is, he asked, doing what was necessary to protect you, your lands, and your people, Gareth Bryn. You blame me for the loss of a barn and some cows. Well, then I suggest that you consider the cost to your people should the Dragon Reborn fail. Sometimes prices must be paid so that a more important duty can be served. I would expect a soldier to understand that. You should have told me, he said, still meeting her eyes. You should have explained who you were. What? Swan asked. Would you have believed me? He hesitated. Besides, she said frankly, I didn't trust you. Our previous meeting had not been particularly amicable, as I recall. Could I have taken that risk, Gareth Bryn, on a man I did not know? Could I have given him control over the secrets I alone knew? Secrets that needed to be passed on to the new Amerlin seat? Should I have spared even a moment when the entire world was wearing the hangman's noose? She held those eyes, demanding an answer. No, he finally admitted. Burn me, Swan, but no. You shouldn't have waited. You shouldn't have made that oath in the first place. You should have been more careful to listen, she said, finally breaking his gaze with a sniff. I suggest that if you swear someone into service in the future, you be careful to stipulate a time frame for that service. Bryn grunted, and Swan whipped the final shirt off of the drying line, causing it to shake, making a blurry shadow on the back wall of the tent. Well, Bryn said, I told myself I'd only hold you to work as long as it took me to get that answer. Now I know. I would say that stop, Swan snapped, spinning on him and pointing. But don't say it, she threatened. I'll gag you and leave you hanging in the air until sundown tomorrow. Don't think that I won't. Bryn sat, silent. I'm not finished with you yet, Gareth Bryn. She whipped the shirt in her hands, then folded it. I shall tell you when I am. Light woman, he muttered almost under his breath. If I'd known you were Aes Sedai before chasing you to Saladar, if I'd known what I was doing... What? She demanded. You wouldn't have hunted me down? Of course I would have, he said indignantly. I'd have just been more careful and perhaps come better prepared. I went off hunting boars with a rabbit knife instead of a spear. Swan set the folded shirt on top of the others, then picked up the stack. She gave him a suffering look. I will do my best to pretend that you didn't just compare me to a boar, Bryn. Kindly be a little more cautious with your tongue. Otherwise, you'll find yourself without a maidservant, and you'll have to let those ladies in the camp take up your laundry. He gave her a bemused look. Then he just laughed. She failed at keeping her own grin to herself. Well, after that exchange, he would know who was in control of this association. But Light, why had she told him about the foretelling? She'd rarely told anyone about that. As she packed the shirts in his trunk, she glanced at Bryn, who was still shaking his head and chuckling. When other oaths no longer have a hold on me, she thought, when I'm certain the Dragon Reborn is doing what he is supposed to, perhaps there will be time. For once I'm actually starting to look forward to being done with this quest. How remarkable. You should be bedding down, Swan, Bryn said. It's early yet, she said. Yes, but it's sunset. Every third day you bed down uncharacteristically early, wearing that odd ring you have hidden between the cushions of your pallet. He turned over a paper on his desk. Please give my kind regards to the Amerlin. She turned toward him, slack-jawed. He couldn't know about Tel-Iran Riyadh, could he? She caught him smiling in satisfaction. Well, perhaps he didn't know about Tel-Iran Riyadh, but he'd obviously guessed that the ring and her schedule had something to do with communicating with Egwene. Sly? He glanced over the top of his papers at her as she passed, and his eyes had a twinkle to them. Insufferable man, she muttered, sitting down on her pallet and dismissing her globe of light. Then she sheepishly fished out the ring Terangreal and put it around her neck, turned her back on him and lay down, trying to will herself to sleep. She made certain to rise early every third day so that she'd be tired at night. She wished she could put herself to sleep as easily as Egwene did. Insufferable, insufferable man! She'd have to do something to get back at him. Mice in the bed sheets. That would be a good payback. She lay for too long a time, but eventually coaxed herself to sleep, smiling faintly to herself at the prospect of an apt revenge. She awoke in Tel-Iran Riyadh wearing nothing but a scandalous, barely covering slip. She yelped, immediately replacing that, through concentration, with a green dress. Green? Why green? She made it blue. Light. How was it that Egwene was always so good at controlling things in Tel-Iran Riyadh, while Swan could barely keep her clothing from switching at every idle thought? It must have something to do with the fact that Swan had to wear this inferior Terangreal copy, which didn't work as well as the original. It made her look insubstantial to others who saw her. She was standing in the middle of the Aes Sedai camp, surrounded by tents.
Everyone.
The flaps of any given structure would be open one moment, then closed the next. The sky was troubled by a violent yet strangely silent storm. Curious. But then things were often strange in Tel-Iran Riyadh. She closed her eyes, willing herself to appear in the study of the Mistress of Novices in the White Tower. When she opened her eyes, she was there. A small wood-paneled room with a stout desk and a table for strappings. She would have liked to have the original ring, but that was carefully kept by the sitters. She should be thankful for even a small catch, as her father had been fond of saying. She could have been left without any of the rings. The sitters thought this one had been with Lyanna when she'd been captured. Was Lyanna all right? At any moment, the false Amerlin could opt for execution. Swan knew all too well how spiteful Elida could be. She still felt a stab of sorrow when she thought of poor Alric. Had Elida felt a single moment of guilt over murdering a warder in cold blood before the woman she was tearing down had been properly deposed? A sword, Swan? Egwene's voice suddenly asked. That's novel. Swan looked down, shocked to find herself holding a bloody sword, likely intended for Elida's heart. She made it vanish, then regarded Egwene. The girl looked the part of the Amerlin, wearing that magnificent golden gown, her brown hair in an intricate arrangement set with pearls. Her face wasn't ageless yet, but Egwene was getting very good at the calm serenity of an Aes Sedai. In fact, she seemed to have grown measurably better at that since her capture. You look well, Mother, Swan said. Thank you, Egwene said with a faint smile. She showed more of herself around Swan than she did the others. They both knew how heavily Egwene had relied on Swan's teaching to get where she was. Though she'd probably have made it there anyway, Swan admitted, just not quite as quickly. Egwene glanced at the room around them, then grimaced faintly. I realize I suggested this location last time, but I have seen enough of this room lately. I will meet you in the novices' dining hall. She vanished. An odd choice, but very unlikely to conceal unwanted ears. Swan and Egwene weren't the only ones who used Tel Rhyad for clandestine meetings. Swan closed her eyes. She didn't need to, but it seemed to help her, and imagined the novices' dining hall with its rows of benches and its bare walls. When she opened her eyes, she was there, as
Number
was
2
Egwene.
down.
The Amerlin settled back, and a majestic stuffed chair appeared behind her, catching her gracefully as she sat. Swan didn't trust herself to do anything so complicated. She simply sat down on one of the benches. I think we may want to start meeting more frequently, Mother, Swan said, tapping the table as she ordered her thoughts. Oh? Egwene asked, sitting up straighter. Has something happened? Several somethings, Swan said, and I'm afraid a few of them smell as ripe as last week's catch. Tell me. One of the Forsaken was in our camp, Swan said. She hadn't wanted to think about that too frequently. The knowledge made her skin crawl. Is anyone dead? Egwene asked, voice calm, though her eyes looked to be steel. No, bless the light, Swan said, other than those you already know about. Ramonda made the connection. Egwene, the creature had been with us for some time in hiding. Who? Delana Mosalane, Swan said. Or her serving woman, Halima. Most likely Halima, as I've known Delana for a great long time. Egwene's eyes widened just faintly. Halima had waited on Egwene. Egwene had been touched and served by one of the Forsaken. She took the news well, like an Amerlin. But Anaya was killed by a man, Egwene said. Were those murders different? No. Anaya wasn't murdered by a man, but by a woman wielding Saidin. It must have been. It's the only thing that makes sense. Egwene nodded slowly. Anything was possible where the Dark One was concerned. Swan smiled in satisfaction and pride. This girl was learning to be Amerlin. Right, she was Amerlin. There's more? Egwene asked. Not much more on this topic, Swan said. They got away from us, unfortunately. Disappeared the very day we discovered them. What warned them, I wonder? Well, that involves one of the other things I need to tell you. Swan took a deep breath. The worst of it was out, but this next part wouldn't be much easier to stomach. There was a meeting of the Hall that day, attended by Delana. In that meeting, an Ashaman announced that he could sense a man channeling in the camp. We think that is what informed her. It wasn't until after Delana fled that we made the connection. It was that same Ashaman who told us that his fellow had encountered a woman who could channel Saidin. Then why was an Ashaman in the camp? Egwene asked coolly. He'd been sent as an envoy, Swan explained. From the Dragon Reborn. Mother, it appears some of the men who follow Althor have bonded Aes Sedai. Egwene blinked a single time. Yes, I had heard rumors of this. I had hoped that they were exaggerated. Did this Ashaman say who gave Rand permission to commit such an atrocity? He's the Dragon Reborn, Swan said, grimacing. I don't think he feels he needs permission. But in his defense, it appears he didn't know it was happening. The women his men bonded were sent by Elida to destroy the Black Tower. Yes, Egwene finally showed a sliver of emotion. So the rumors are accurate. All too accurate. Her beautiful dress retained its shape, but bled to a deep brown in color, like Aiel clothing. Egwene didn't seem to notice the change. Will Elida's reign of disasters never cease? Swan just shook her head. We've been offered 47 Ashaman to bond as restitution of sorts for the women Althor's men bonded. Hardly a fair trade, but the Hall decided to accept the offer nonetheless. As well they should have, Egwene said. We shall have to deal with the dragon's foolishness at a later date. Perhaps his men acted without his direct orders, but Rand must take responsibility. Men. Bonding women. They claim Saidin is cleansed, Swan said. Egwene raised an eyebrow, but did not object. Yes, she said. I suppose that might be a reasonable possibility. We will need further confirmation, of course. But the taint arrived when all seemed one. Why should it not leave when all seems to be approaching pure madness? I hadn't considered it that way, Swan said. Well, what should we do, Mother? Let the Hall deal with it, Egwene said. It seems they have matters in hand. They'd be better at keeping them in hand if you'd return, Mother. Eventually, Egwene said. She sat back and laced her fingers in her lap, somehow looking far older than her face would suggest. My work is here, for now. You'll have to see that the Hall does as it should. I have great faith in you. And it's appreciated, Mother, Swan said, keeping her frustration inside. But I'm losing control of them. Lilane has begun to set herself up as a second Amerlin, and is doing it by pretending to support you. She's seen that appearing to act in your name serves herself. Egwene pursed her lips. I would have thought Ramonda would take the advantage, considering that she discovered the Forsaken. I think she assumed she'd hold the advantage, Swan said, but she spent too long basking in her victory. Lilane has, with no small effort, become the most devoted servant of the Amerlin who has ever lived. You would think that you and she were the closest of confidants to hear her speak. She's appropriated me as her attendant, and each time the Hall meets, it's, Egwene wanted this, and remember what Egwene said when we did that. Clever, Egwene said. Brilliant, Swan said, sighing. But we knew one of them was eventually going to claw her way ahead of the other. I keep diverting her toward Ramonda, but I don't know how long I can keep her distracted. Do your best, Egwene said. But don't worry if Lilane refuses to be diverted. Swan frowned. But she's usurping your place. By building upon it, Egwene said, smiling. She finally noticed that her dress had changed to brown, for she switched it back in a heartbeat, not breaking the conversation.
It's almost about that time
Lilane's gambit will only succeed if I fail to return. She is using me as a source of authority. When I return, she'll have no choice but to accept my leadership. She'll have spent all of her effort building me up. And if you don't return, Mother? Swan asked softly. Then it will be better for the Aes Sedai to have a strong leader, Egwene said. If Lilane has been the one to secure that strength, then so be it. She has good reason to make certain you don't return, you know, Swan said. At the very least, she's betting against you. Well, she can't very well be blamed for that. Egwene let down her guard enough to show a grimace. I'd be tempted to bet against myself if I were on the outside. You'll simply have to deal with her, Swan. I can't let myself be distracted. Not when I see so much potential for success here, and not when there is an even greater price for failure. Swan knew that stubborn set to Egwene's jaw. There would be no persuading her tonight. Swan would simply have to try again during their next meeting. All of it, the cleansing, the ashaman, the crumbling of the tower, made her shiver uncomfortably. Though she'd been preparing for these days for most of her life, it was still unsettling to have them finally arrive. The last battle really is coming, Swan said, mostly to herself. It is, Egwene said, voice solemn. And I'm going to face it with barely a lick of my former power, Swan said, grimacing. Well, perhaps we can get you an Angreal once the tower is whole again, Egwene said. We'll be using everything we have when we ride against the shadow. Swan smiled. That would be nice, but not necessary. I'm just grumbling out of habit, I suppose. I'm actually learning to deal with my new situation. It's not so difficult to stomach, now that I see that it has some advantages. Egwene frowned, as if trying to figure out what advantages there could be in lessened power. Finally, she shook her head. Elaine once mentioned a room to me in the tower filled with objects of power. I assume it really exists? Of course, Swan said. The basement storeroom. It's in the second level of the basement, on the northeast side. Little room with a plain wooden door, but you can't miss it. It's the only one in the hallway that is locked. Egwene nodded to herself. Well, I can't defeat Elida through brute force. Still, it is nice to know of that. Is there anything else remarkable to report? Not at the moment, Mother, Swan said. Then return and get some sleep. Egwene hesitated. And next time, we'll meet in 2 days. Here in the novices' dining hall, though we may want to begin meeting out in the city. I don't trust this place. If there was a Forsaken in our camp, I'd bet half my father's inn that there's one spying on the White Tower, too. Swan nodded. Very well. She closed her eyes and soon found herself blinking awake, back in Bryn's tent. The candle was out, and she could hear Bryn breathing quietly from his pallet on the other side of the tent. She sat up and looked across at him, though it was too dark to see anything more than shadows. Strangely, after talking about Forsaken and Ashaman, the sturdy general's presence comforted her. Is there anything else remarkable to report, Egwene? Swan thought idly, rising to change out of her dress behind the screen and put on her sleeping gown. I think I might be in love. Is that remarkable enough? To her it seemed stranger than the taint being cleansed or a woman channeling Sidene. Shaking her head, she tucked the dream ter'angreal back in its hiding place, then snuggled down beneath her blankets. She'd forego the mice, just this once.
Chapter 9. Leaving Malden.
All right, I'm going to call into his life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone who keeps stopping by. Hey, F5, have a good night. Definitely appreciate you stopping by. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.